Very good morning to everyone who's watching this webinar at our Zoom and on our YouTube channel. And good evening to Ibu Mari, Pangestu, and Aaditya in Washington, D.C. This is Saturday morning here and Friday night in Washington, D.C. Thank you for agreeing to do this, Ibu Mari and Aaditya. The first webinar and with Ibu Mari since Ibu Mari left Indonesia, and we are honored to have the two distinguished speaker. Ibu Mari is now the World Bank Managing Director for Development Policy and Partnership, and also we have Pak Aaditya Matto, the Chief Economist for East Asia and the Pacific region of the World Bank. And we are going to talk about the elephant in the room, that is COVID-19, but it's from the perspective of the two economists, basically, on East Asia and the Pacific in this time of COVID-19 crisis. And we are going to be moderated by our own researcher, economist at CSIS, Dandi Rafitrandi. Hand over to you, Dandi.
Thank you, Mas Philip, for the opening remarks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dandi Rafitrandi, and I'm a researcher at the Department of Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Jakarta. I will be the moderator for this webinar. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to CSIS public webinar on East Asia and the Pacific in the time of COVID-19. Firstly, I hope that you are in good health in this challenging time, and thank you very much for joining us. For this morning's webinar, we are very honored to have two distinguished speakers with us right now, Professor Mari Pangestu and Dr. Aaditya Matto from the World Bank. Good evening, Bu Mari and Dr. Matto. Professor Mari Pangestu is the World Bank Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships, oversees the Research and Data Group of the World Bank and the External and Corporate Relations functions. She also served as Indonesia's Minister of Trade from 2004 to 2011, and as Minister of Tourism and Creative Economy from 2011 to 2014. Of course, she's also a member of the Board of Trustees at CSIS Foundation. I think this is your very first time to speak in webinar, Ibu, ya?
Yes.
First, and then also in Indonesia.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I think
as the managing director.
As a managing director of the World Bank. So we are very excited to have you here, Bu. So our second speaker, Dr. Aaditya Matto, is the Chief Economist of the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank. He specialized in development, trade, and international cooperation and provides policy advice to governments as well. He's also a co-director of the World Development Report in 2020 on global value chains. And recently, Dr. Matto and his team just released the World Bank East Asia and Pacific Economic Update in April 2020 on East Asia and Pacific in the time of COVID-19. I'm glad to have you again with us, Dr. Matto. I think since the discussion of the WTDR at our office early this year, so I'm pretty sure that we will have another fruitful discussion this morning. So we will start the session with Professor Pangestu and followed by Dr. Matto's presentation. There will be around 35 minutes for the Q&A, a quick Q&A session after all of the presentations. And lastly, I want to kindly remind for all the participants to use the Q&A feature so I can gather some of questions later. Without further ado, I think I may invite Professor Pangestu and Dr. Matto to deliver the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dandi. I'm going to kick off our discussion today. But before the discussion, let me just say selamat pagi bagi bapak-bapak dan ibu-ibu dan teman-teman. Bagi yang menjalankan ibadah puasa, selamat menjalankan ibadah puasa dan mohon maaf lahir dan batin. Senang sekali bisa untuk melakukan webinar ini. As Dandy said, this is my very first webinar, and I'm very happy to be doing it at CSIS, for CSIS in Indonesia, for our friends in Indonesia. So I'm going to kick off the discussion on the global picture and the kind of the broad policy framework that we're all trying to work with in terms of how to deal with this, especially not just the health impact, but the economic and social impact of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So, and then Aaditya is going to come in and take an East Asia Pacific look, and I think he will also talk about Indonesia specific issues and numbers as well, because of the most recently released East Asia Pacific update, which has kind of, it's very difficult to do projections with a lot of uncertainties there, but he will be able to explain to you, especially for the case of East Asia and Pacific. So if you want to take like the global overview and picture, I think everybody knows. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm just going to speak to a number of key messages and key points. Everybody knows it's bad. And it's, you hear terminology like unprecedented, the worst since post-war, and the worst ever, and so on and so forth. So it's bad, and we all know, because we have a supply shock and a demand shock happening at the same time, with cross-border spillovers on trade, finance, capital flows or outflows, remittances in some of the developing countries. This is something that I've been learning as the Managing Director of Development Policy, because we're looking at the whole world. Some countries get more than half of their foreign exchange reserves from remittances. So the moment that stops, then you can imagine what happens to those countries. Tourism, small island states like Maldives, 90% or maybe all of their income comes from tourism, that stops. And commodity prices on top of that. So countries which are dependent on commodity exports, and also for their budget revenues, they really get a big shock. So it's bad. And on top of that, it's going to spill over to financial shocks, as well as corporate non-performing loans and all that. And the world started, the other issue that is perhaps we try to compare with 2008 especially, the situation was already weak to begin with. Compared in 2008, you actually started out with countries in not such a bad situation. Then the crisis happened. And then we haven't really fully recovered, as you know. So we are starting the initial condition before the shock was already quite shaky. So, and the final thing to just mention is that this crisis hit all countries. In 2008, it hit the developed countries, and then the developing countries had a spillover effect. In the Asian financial crisis, it was the Asian countries which had a contagion effect, but the developed countries were in good state. So that's, I think, why we're in really, everybody talks about a deep recession. So I don't want to really get into too much discussion about how bad is it going to be, where are we going to be. I just want to ask a question. I just want to help us think through this question. How deep is the recession and how quick is the recovery? Yeah, because that will hopefully help us to think about, therefore, what are the kind of policies that we need to have to maybe just hold on, try to protect livelihoods and lives in the recession period, and then work towards the recovery. So if in the World Bank, we have a group called the Global Economic Prospects, and you will see later on, Aditya's presentation will use this. So when we talk about the baseline, this is I guess you could say the best case scenario. You're talking about a V-shaped recovery where we expect the best, where you can have containment of isolation, self-distancing, and the impact of no economic activity for another 3 months. And then you start resuming growth in the third quarter in phases. You open up in phases. You regain financial market stability and investor confidence. You have fiscal and monetary stimulus help you get out of the recession and back to recovery for the next 18 months. That's kind of the assumption of the baseline, kind of a V-shaped I guess it's not really V, it's kind of like this. Maybe it's a bit of a U. But even under that scenario, the global economy will go into a deep recession in 2020, and developing countries will grow at -2%, compared to an average of 4.6% since 1960. So it's the worst, it's the, you can say the worst that developing countries are experiencing. Even Africa, which has not had negative growth for the last 2 or 3 decades, is going to experience negative growth. This will push 50 million additional people into extreme poverty, and I don't know, hundreds and millions into poor and near poor. So that's how deep is the recession and how quick to recover. But that's assuming it's going to be starting to recover in the 3rd quarter and so on and so forth. What if none of that happens? Then you're going to have a deeper recession. And the prediction is that the risks are tilted to the downside, where you could end up having -3% contraction for developing countries. And that's really bad, will have a very big impact on poverty and inequality, and undo a decade probably worth of what we have achieved to reduce poverty. The risk of a deeper downturn is if you have a lingering pandemic and you don't succeed in the mitigation measures. That's why the emergency period of mitigation is still very key. And a financial stress turns into a financial crisis. And you have limited effectiveness of the policy support for helping the poor and so on. And the commodity price stays down or even continues to go down for longer. So that will not allow for recovery for countries which are dependent on commodities. And that's the risk of a deeper downturn. Risk of a slower recovery is if you have long-lasting economic disruptions, high debt burdens weighing on activity. That's why the World Bank recently, jointly with the IMF, called on G20 countries, not on G20 countries, called on official creditors to give debt suspension to IDA countries, which are the poorest countries. And that's hopefully will give some fiscal space to some of the poorest countries. And you will have a slower recovery if you have fragmentation and retreat from global value chains. So if you have increased protectionism, increased nationalism, restrictiveness still being in place, then you will have a much slower recovery. And larger than expected adverse impact on potential growth. Another risk for slower recovery is social unrest. If you cannot take care of the livelihoods of your people, if you have start having food insecurity, you could have that outcome. So that's kind of the question of the risk of a deeper recession and a slower recovery. So what should we do? What we are trying to think through here is, okay, things are bad. They could be bad, or very, very bad, depending on how long you think the recession is and how long you think it's going to get out of recovery. So let's think very hard on, therefore, what are the policies that we need to have in place to make sure that during this deep recession part or the mitigation part, where you need to still continue to have social distancing and lockdown, what do you need to do? And then what do you need to do in the short term when you are still going to have a recession? And then what do you do to get out of it, to the recovery part? So this is a lot of the thinking that we're going through right now in the bank, is thinking about this and trying to think and help countries that we are giving assistance to think through. And this applies, I'll just give you some broad principles, and then I'm going to end on there, and then Aaditya is going to tell you what the East Asia Pacific picture looks like. In the short term, the emergency response to protect lives is still key. Yeah, and this we call this smart containment, because you do have to have the help, continue to have the health intervention, and you have to have make sure that your frontline workers, your health workers, are protected, and you have to have the testing and the tracing, because that's the only way you're going to have the containment. I know you've had lots of webinars on this, so I'm not going to go into detail, but it is absolutely necessary, and the key is data to be able to do that, and you need to be able to use that. And I just wanted to mention two things because people don't really think about it too much, but you need clean water and sanitation to be continued or even upgraded, because you know how you ask people to wash hands, but if they don't have water, how are they going to wash hands, right? And we need to also continue global coordination in health policies, even in the short term. So that's kind of the emergency response period. Now, let me just close with a kind of the framework for the policies. You need to do short-term policies that will protect livelihoods. So first emergency is protect lives. The second short-term can be 3 months, can be 6 months, is, or it can be longer, depending on how deep this recession that we're going to go through. You need to undertake smart continuous smart containment policies in the short term to protect livelihoods. That means protecting the poor and the vulnerable, protecting firms, and protecting the government protecting the government in the sense that it has to continue to deliver essential services. But what you do in the short term needs to be calibrated very carefully or strategically to make sure that what you do in the short term is not going to create damage in the medium term when you're trying to recover, because that's going to affect how fast you can recover, or in fact may end up leading you to a slower or even no recovery, right? So there is a link between what you do in the short term and medium term, and that needs to be thought through carefully. Let me just give you some examples to try to make that story resonate with you. In the smart containment period, where you are having to do continue to do the tracing, it's actually spatial, right? If you have good data and tracking, you'll know where the hotspots are. But there are areas where it's less of a hotspot. And there are economic activities that still need to continue, especially food. I'm very concerned about food security or food insecurity. So farmers need to get their inputs. First of all, farmers have to be able to go out and still plant. They still have to get their input for the seeds. They need financing. They need to be able to plant. Otherwise, you're going to miss the planting season. Right now, it's going to come into planting season. Then you're going to be affected the harvest down the road. Not to mention the supply chain that still needs to happen. So workers in essential goods, you have to use the definition essential goods, medical, food, and other vital goods. They need to continue to function, right? And so it's both to make sure that the activity continues and making sure that the protocols are there. Okay, farmers can work, but how do you do the social distancing when you're working as in the farm? Factories that can continue to produce, can still continue to do that as long as they have protocols. I talked to one of my friends the other day. She has a garment factory in Indonesia, and she told me that she's still continuing to produce because she still has orders for export. But she's practicing social distancing in the factory, and she's following all the protocols. She got permission from the Ministry of Industry to continue to produce. And actually, she has to hire more workers because of social distancing. I thought that was an interesting story. And she's still continuing to get orders. And she repurposed some of her lines to produce protective clothing for non-medical use and masks. Right? So that's just an example of how smart containment can continue. And of course, how do you do social protection well? One of our, those of us who are good economists will say that you need to do good targeting and make it effective and monitor. But I think in today's situation, who is poor, near poor is becoming very blurred. So we think that you should have a principle which is broad-based, and you should use all the tools that are available. You should scale up whatever is available in your country, like social protection, cash transfer programs that are already there, and scale it up. And sometimes, in some cases, food in kind may be more important, like delivering food. And you should use community-based driven development whenever you can. Indonesia is actually very lucky. They have quite a strong community-driven based development, like the program desa. Yeah, if you could actually use that and drive delivery, that would be good. The other thing that we thought about was that it's very hard to get, the second part of it is protecting firms and jobs, right? Very difficult to target the informal sector. So sometimes when you are giving cash transfer to households, it's almost the same as like giving help to the micro enterprises because they're working from households. Okay, that's, let me just say a few more words about firms, some of the ideas about protecting livelihoods and jobs and firms. I think some of the programs that are there need to be thought through carefully. If you want to give a debt moratorium to SMEs, to micro enterprises, it sounds good, but don't forget it will have a knock-on effect on the banking sector that are giving the lending, unless you've thought through how to make sure the banks are not going to be impacted by it. That's an example of, oh yes, I need to save the firms, but then you take a policy which may then have a medium-term impact, a knock-on effects on others. But we need to think about how to make sure firms can continue to have liquidity and not become insolvent when you're going to have the recovery. So wage subsidies are some examples, and what is it? Tax breaks. Those are things that Indonesia is doing. I think the final thing I would say is that a big issue is, how do you socialize losses? What's going to happen is, at the end of the day, we are used to knowing what a financial crisis is or a banking crisis is, where you have the government or the central bank become the lender of last resort. But in this crisis, it's the government is the insurer of last resort. The government is the one that has to save the people, the firms, jobs, and even themselves, in the sense that they need to still be able to deliver the basic services of a government, right? So this is going to be it's going to be more important later on when you're trying to recover, because you will have to probably give assistance. I'm not going to use the word bailouts, but assistance, loans, and in the end, you will end up having assets that will be actually, some of it will be owned by the state. And if it's state-owned enterprises, of course, it's owned by the state. So how do you, in the recovery, how do you get back to a more normal situation? So I think probably I've already taken my 15 minutes. That's kind of the big picture on the policy framework. There's a lot more that can be said, but I think the main message is, how do we undertake steps during this deep recession to make sure lives are protected, firms can continue to be liquid, so that in the recovery they can immediately start working, and do it in a way which is going to make you be stronger, build better, build stronger. So that final component I haven't really touched, but there's a lot of discussion about what are the reforms that you need to undertake, that you could undertake while you are going to be doing the recovery, building back better, building back stronger, including making sure that you are paying attention to issues like gender and climate change and inequality and so on. So maybe I'll stop there, because I probably have taken more than my 15 minutes, but we can always come back to any of these big picture issues when we discuss further in the question and answer. So over to you, Aaditya, to give us the East Asia picture.
Thank you very much. Mari, you've presented both the big picture and the human details. What I will try and do over the next few minutes is just give a sense of the intermediate statistical picture, which is going to be neither as enlightening as the big picture, nor as moving as the human details you provided. I'll talk briefly about the nature of this shock and how it's affecting the East Asia and Pacific region. As Dandy said at the beginning, we have recently released the regional EAP, East Asia and Pacific Economic Update. And I'd encourage you all to take a look at it, because it is richly detailed and richly textured, and it speaks in some effect to all the challenges that the region and the individual countries are facing. The main point I want to make today in my presentation is that this disease is regressive, both in the sense that it hurts the poor more than the rich, and in the sense that it threatens to lock us and erode the growth benefits that the region has reaped over many years. And our response must be progressive. And understanding how it can both benefit and empower the poor, and also how it can be informed by what is to come. It should anticipate the technological and structural changes that are going to happen in the future. Today, as you just heard, containing the disease is the biggest priority, and it's most important to stop the suffering. First, by treating its victims, and second, by preventing its spread. Recent projections that you people must have seen from the Imperial College suggest that left to itself, millions of people would die from this disease. Therefore, countries have to contain, as Ibu Mari said, its spread. Now, there are two contrasting responses, and I'll come back to it again in the context of the presentation. Those who had been prepared have been able to take more moderate action, relying on testing, tracking, and targeted isolation and quarantines. Those are the countries like Singapore, the Republic of Korea, and Germany. They learned, some of them, from their past experience with SARS and MERS, and had invested in the capacity that enabled them to take these measures. Other countries which were less prepared have had to rely on stringent social isolation measures. That is what has really created the economic shock, because if people cannot work, they cannot spend, they cannot meet, then the profound distress that we are seeing in economic terms is what we must face. For Indonesia too, the University of Indonesia has done projections which show that unmitigated disease would lead to, or unmitigated actions would lead to the spread of the disease in a way that would overwhelm the healthcare system. And progressively tougher suppression could significantly reduce the spread of the disease. Now, as we see across the region, the number of confirmed cases has tended to increase, and in response, more and more countries are taking stringent lockdowns and other ways of trying to suppress the disease. Now, these are the actions that have been at the heart of the domestic economic disruption. As Ibu Mari said, there's a demand shock, there's a supply shock, and globally, we are seeing this being played out in some of the most important countries in the world. The 17 most important global nodes in the international production network have been hit, and they account for more than 70% of all trade. And we, since the age of global value chains began in the 1990s, our destinies are increasingly intertwined. GDP and economic activity in each country is strongly correlated with that in other countries. And that is the reason that when global economic activity contracts, that communicates itself as a tough shock in terms of contracting trade. At the same time, because this shock is so unusual in both its depth and duration, and it's so uncertain that it's spooking financial markets. And you are beginning to see capital flight from emerging markets and tightening financial conditions for many countries in the region. As a consequence, these shocks are being transmitted to the region through both contraction potentially in exports, especially for a region which is heavily exposed to the rest of the world, as well as in imports. Now, there are countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, which are deeply integrated in global value chains, and therefore they are suffering both a demand shock and a supply disruption shock. Indonesia, by a somewhat less desirable fact of being relatively peripheral to global value chains, is less exposed. It is also less exposed than countries like in the Pacific or Cambodia or Thailand to tourism in relative terms, relative to its GDP, but it is more commodity dependent. And therefore, the precipitous decline in commodity prices is going to communicate itself as a shock to Indonesia. We projected in the update the growth consequences. And as Ibu Mari said, we had a base projection for Indonesia of 2.1%, but also a downside. A downside if some of the assumptions that Ibu Mari talked about, that there will be rapid containment, that there won't be huge financial hangover, that there won't be a persistence of trade disruption. If those things were to happen, we had anticipated even a significant contraction. And the most recent projections for the Indonesian economy suggest that growth will come to a halt. Now, if that happens, a lot of the poverty reduction that was happening will slow down. Fewer people will be lifted out of poverty. And if growth becomes negative, poverty could increase by as many as 11 million people in the region. In a country like Indonesia, even if growth comes to a halt, so that in the aggregate people are not worse off, within certain sectors like tourism-related sectors, retail, and even manufacturing and commodities, poverty rates could double, especially if the income losses persist not just for the first quarter, but extend towards the second quarter. That is the sense in which it's not just the disease, but our response to it, our necessary response to it in terms of curtailing all social mingling, whether it's on the factory floor or whether it's in a cinema hall, is leading to a relatively devastating effect, especially on the poor. And among the most vulnerable are those who are in this legally invisible informal sector. I was stunned to see that in Indonesia, 3/4 of the non-agricultural employment is in fact informal employment. These are the people who don't have steady incomes, and these are the people, when they are shut out of economic activity, are very hard to reach through social welfare, social protection programs. Now, this is a slide I took from recent work that my colleague Satu, who's there, and her team have put together, which also makes the same point that Ibu Mari made, that how you recover will depend on what is done to contain. And they nicely lay out 4 steps, which exactly echo the points that you just heard. First, given that the pain is going to be a consequence of the containment, let's find a way to make that restriction as minimal and as short as possible. Provide relief, help firms survive, and then think of the broader structural reforms which will facilitate recovery. In this context, I would like to now make a few policy points. And as I said, my main thrust is that the disease has been really regressive. How can we frame a response which is genuinely progressive? Now, one flaw, I think, in the response across the world has been to think of the problem as compartmentalized. That on the one hand, what is referred to as the flattening of the infection curve, which is to try and prevent our health capacity from being overwhelmed by a rapid increase in infections, has been seen as the containment objective to be achieved primarily through public health means. And there, for those who are not prepared, those means have meant an extreme suppression of economic activity, as I showed you. The pain is meant to be addressed through the separate instrument of macroeconomic policy, because there is a recognition: the tougher the suppression, the steeper the recession. And so the argument is that we need to use all the policies at our disposal, whether it is social protection, whether it's firm assistance, whether it's lending more resources to the banking sector or for direct government transfers, that those are the instruments which will be used to mitigate the pain. The problem is that the objective is overall welfare. And if we take an integrated view of both public health and macro policies, we are likely to achieve better outcomes. And that's very evident when you see the experience again of countries like Germany or the Republic of Korea, who have used moderate suppression, but stronger public health measures. But that's been possible because of the investments they made early. Now, this striking new evidence and work this was a presentation at the World Bank yesterday by a Bangladeshi economist who's done very detailed work on Bangladesh on the ground. And the point he makes is that should low-income countries follow the suppression strategies of high-income countries? Now, I for one believe that the stringent restrictions are necessary. But it's also true that the economic cost for poor people is much higher. And the economic and the health benefit for relatively younger populations is also possibly lower unless you take into account the other vulnerabilities in developing countries from pollution and illness. The central argument is that, as Ibu Mari said, governments must choose their optimal strategy. But the better informed they are, the more they can soften the trade-off between health and economic benefits. Testing tells us more. And that means that in certain states of the world, a better informed government can get, for any given level of economic activity, better health outcomes by testing for the disease, and perhaps in the near future, also testing for immunity. It also means that any desired level of suppression can be achieved with less economic cost. Let me illustrate this, because I think one of the most important questions for us today, the only plan B is to develop the capacity to test, trace, and isolate. Because otherwise, even if you succeed in suppressing too quickly, like China has done, the risk of the disease coming back remains very high. And here is a chart which just shows you the level of infected, especially if you have a suppression strategy, and it shows you how many people have recovered. The recovered are simply the sum of all those who were infected in the past. So I recognize that we are not completely sure that immunity lasts forever. But right at the beginning, those red zone at the beginning, you could have, like Singapore, like Republic of Korea, if you had had the capacity to use test, trace, and isolate, to have containment without economic pain. That's too late for many developing countries. But if we could invest in that capacity, it is also possible that when suppression reduces the levels of infection sufficiently, it will be possible to use that strategy to shorten the period of suppression. If you could do it just by 2 weeks, some economic analysis that we have done suggests that the gains could be as much as 1% of GDP. That means $20 billion for an economy like Indonesia. And that's why I think that one of the most progressive responses to the disease is genuinely to try as far as possible, as Indonesia is already doing, its capacity to test and has dramatically increased in the recent past. This is a complicated picture that I don't expect you to understand, but this is again a piece of work that we have done. It was a little premature, this piece of work, because it anticipated that we might also be able to credibly and reliably test for immunity. But let me just say that the science is expanding fast, the innovations are coming fast. If it turns out to be true that we can credibly, reliably test for immunity, then that's also a way of softening the impact of these shutdowns by liberating at least some workers to go back and work. But that remains to be seen. This kind of informed action could be profoundly valuable for a country like Indonesia, where the evidence suggests from the Indonesia COVID-19 task force that there are wide variations in the degree of infection. And that means you could have shutdowns which are much more tailored to individual circumstances, but based on evidence rather than guesswork. Now, what is to be done? And here again, I think Ibu Mari anticipated almost everything of significance that I was going to say. Many poor countries don't have social insurance programs, which automatically kick in bad states of the world. Therefore, they have to rely much more on social assistance. And that's exactly what has been happening. In Indonesia, the PKH program of transfers has been scaled up. The food in-food assistance program has been scaled up, and a range of different actions are being taken across the country. But one gap, and I would love to know whether I've got this right, I'm struck by how many of the elderly in Indonesia are poor. Nearly 60% of the elderly are poor. And Indonesia spends almost very little compared to other countries on pensions or old age support. So right at one end of the spectrum, where it comes to the elderly who are most vulnerable to the disease, most likely to have to make big out-of-pocket payments for treatment, there is very little support. But then at the other end, where it comes to equipping children to survive, and not just survive, but build the human capital that is necessary in the future, as well as for workers to retain the skill, there is a different problem. There's very unequal access to digital medium in Indonesia. So the whole possibility of switching for schools and other people to learn, to stay engaged through electronic media in this situation is very unequally distributed. What can be done to make sure that we don't just help workers survive, but actually create the kind of skills that will be necessary in tomorrow's post-COVID economy? Similarly, for firms, countries in the region have taken a wide variety of measures, both for the real sector, like tax relief and subsidies, and as well as for the financial sector, like regulatory forbearance, going easy on claiming back loans. But there is again very interesting evidence from Indonesia based on the earlier 97 financial crisis, which asks the following question. Are crises good because they sought out the strong and good firms from the weak firms which are controlling resources, which should ideally be liberated and lead to the growth of the big firms? And the answer is no. A crisis is indiscriminate in its destruction. And that is why what Ibu Mari said, that at this stage, helping firms survive is crucial. But then it's an interesting question, how? There, the evidence suggests that where worker-firm relationships are important, where workers have invested in learning that is important for the firm to function, and the firm has invested in training that also makes the workers more productive, that kind of match not just between workers and firms, but also between firms and firms in global value chains. Those matches need to be preserved. And evidence from Sri Lanka post-tsunami suggests that it's cash grants which really helped SMEs survive. And evidence from Mexico from the financial crisis suggests that wage subsidies can speed up recovery, because those firms which have been able to keep their more valuable workers with them, employed, even partially, are the ones who can jump up and expand production. Similarly, there is a risk about directed credit. In Brazil, the credit came for good reason, but then was politically captured. It didn't reach those who needed it, it reached those who were well connected. And that is a risk even in a country like Indonesia. And that's why in many cases for the informal sector, it is direct assistance of the kind that you just heard about that is most valuable. Finally, and this is a point that we are thinking hard about, and I would welcome both your feedback and collaborative work, that how do we anticipate the post-COVID economy? We see an acceleration of certain types of technological change. How much the digital economy will grow, the investments we are making which will not be reversible, which might create a huge growth, for example, in services trade by making it so much easier now to transact internationally relative to domestically than it ever used to be when you were transacting more face-to-face. How do we anticipate the structural changes that are going to happen? Will retail ever come back to what it was? Will certain kinds of tourism and international transport come back quickly to what they were? I think that's why it's also really important to think about how we don't just help firms to survive, but how can we help them to flourish when finally this pall of disease lifts. Similarly, in the financial sector, again, Ibu Mari anticipated the issue. There is a real risk. There is a real need first to help through regulatory forbearance, to provide both credit to consumers to help them smooth consumption, also liquidity to firms to help them to survive. But we must not sow the seeds of future financial instability. Even as banks are encouraged to lend, transparency, risk disclosure should be high, especially when debt is high. And you know, the egregious mistakes of the big Great Recession, the financial crisis, should not be allowed to happen again, where financial institutions distribute dividends and bonuses even as they are being plied with additional liquidity and capital. And again, the key question, how do we ensure that lending is according to need rather than connectedness? And lending is also, in some sense, risky, because it's not just a question of playing it safe. It's a question of investing in some new technologies and new firms which might offer the kind of dynamism that will be needed in the post-COVID economy. Finally, trade policy. Indonesia, like many other countries, has been tempted for legitimate human reasons to impose export restrictions. Even the paragons of openness like Germany have resorted to the same restrictions. I think the trade restrictions can be self-defeating because, you know, if you impose export restrictions in masks and somebody else imports export restrictions in testing equipment, and even worse, when vaccines finally become available, how do we ensure that they won't be subject to export restriction? When treatment becomes available, how do we ensure? Because almost certainly to begin with, there will not be enough. That's why trade is a metaphor for the deeper global cooperation and the deeper test both for individuals, our institution, and our countries. Will we fight this disease together, or will we say everyone for themselves? Will countries now revert to scarcity nationalism, or will they say, no, we believe in international cooperation? Will we respect the rules which make the sum so much greater than the parts? Or will we revert to the kind of prisoner's dilemmas which lead to these non-cooperative outcomes which are bad for everybody? I think I'll end with this because I know Ibu Mari has been a champion of openness and trade for a long time. And I would like our institution and Indonesia to continue to speak for the big gains from international cooperation, not just on trade, not just on fighting the disease, but also in encouraging production of new innovative treatments and vaccines. And that, I think, is the kind of environment that we'd like to all wake up to when this disease has disappeared. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibu Mari Pangestu and Dr. Matto. So now I would like to read some questions that are already gathered by our team. So the first question is related to the middle class part of Indonesia. So yeah, we know that we have a large number of aspiring middle class part, which they're not poor, so they might not get the benefit for the poor people. So what kind of policy that the government should done to this part of society, the aspiring middle class?
Are you going to collect questions, or are you going to
Oh, okay.
do one by one?
I think one by one, Ibu.
One by one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, but I think that's why a broad-based approach is what is now being advocated. But I think it's not. It'll be very country dependent. For the middle class, you could think of, how do you preserve their jobs in the first place, and that will come through actually the firms. How you help the firms give the wage subsidies. So I think we are all struggling actually in thinking through how to have good policies to help firms survive. And usually you protect the workers, but now the thinking is it's not, you're not protecting the workers, but you actually want to protect the jobs, and that therefore it's going through the firms. So things like wage subsidies is one particular way to give assistance, and I think to the extent you can offer training to give them the opportunity to do training to upgrade themselves when the crisis is over, that would be another way. In America, they trying to give assistance through the mortgage payments. Again, those kind of, if you have the problem with developing countries is that we don't have deep pockets. In the US, you can see people can get unemployment benefits, and it's blanket. As small businesses get help blanket wise, and then you can get help on mortgage payments. But because we don't have that luxury to have deep pockets, you have to find a way to target. There are trade-offs. Who are you going to help? Yeah. So I think for middle class, it is really going to be quite difficult. It can potentially go through the banking system by some kind of loan programs, but I think those are just some ideas. I don't really have a good solution. I think in the 2008 crisis, a lot of people went back to school actually, and I think the US or a few countries had programs to allow people to go back to school. When you lose your job, then you go back to school to upgrade yourself. So that would be the skill part of it.
Okay. I think I have to agree. Also regarding the data and related to this, the middle class. Do you have any opinion about that? How we actually gather a good data on to obtain a good target and then to help them during this pandemic.
Maybe Aaditya, you want to come in?
No,
Yeah,
I think
please.
Ibu Mari, I agree completely with what you said. You know, and I would also, if Satu, the country director, Ibu Satu, if she wanted to say, because it's a very good point that, you know, the poorest people here, I mean, Indonesia has, you know, things like the PKH and the Sembako, but there is a class of people who are not included even in things like this, I think this digital or base, the DTKS. So we simply don't know who they are. And this kind of middle 40% is actually going to face strong distress at this time, because one of the aspects of this crisis is it's hit not just manufacturing, it's hit in fact the services sectors the most, and that's where, in a way, apart from the you know, poor urban poor who are in the informal sector, it will also hit the middle class who are often service sector workers. And therefore, I think it's a very nice point that Ibu Mari said, which ties up with what I was saying, that, you know, human capital acquisition sometimes is counter-cyclical. When people can't work, they learn, they invest, and they improve. But I do think that this is such a hard crisis that being better informed. Now, how much, I think some of the bank support that is being provided is precisely to increase the quality of information. You know, the kind of example that in India, by creating the Aadhaar or the unique identifier, has helped the government make much more direct transfers and reach a wider section of the population, because I think this is a crisis which will not spare the middle class. But I don't know if Ibu Satu wants to add to it, because in their work they might have been already have a sense, but I don't want to put her on the spot either. So if she wants to say something.
Aditya, this is Satu. Selamat pagi to everybody.
Selamat pagi.
This is a very good question, because the government has extended quite significantly to social assistance in the past month or so. So many existing social assistance programs have been expanded and the payouts have been increased. But we did the analysis to assess to what extent will this help to cover the population. And indeed, I mean, there is a middle. There are people who are in the middle, who are not very wealthy, who are not in the firm middle class, but who belong to this aspiring middle class, who are not fully covered. And our estimates show that yes, the poverty in Indonesia will increase quite substantially, despite the measures put in place as a result of the crisis. Now, few measures that the government has introduced will help this group. There are food vouchers that are now given. There are cash for work programs. There are also attempts to use the village level programs. This is the CDP approach that Ibu Mari talked about, to reach some of these people. And hopefully some of the measures that are now extended to the business side will also reach some of them. But this is precisely an area where we are also very much working on now and trying to identify further ways to reach these people. And it's a challenge. But if I know that the government is thinking about it and we are thinking about it. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much. So the next question is about the lockdown policy. What makes COVID-19 social impact greater on Indonesia compared to other regional countries, even though Indonesia, as we know, does not really apply the lockdown policy? So the trade-off between lockdown policy and also the economy. is the policy implemented by the Indonesian government in terms of the amount of stimulus appropriate and the amount is sufficient? That's the second question. From Cornelia Ayu.
I didn't really get the first question, but I think it was the trade-off between lockdown and social and economic impact.
Yeah, also the comparison between the regional Indonesia and then other countries in the region.
I think all countries are almost similar in the sense that the lockdown has caused a lot of economic activity to basically stop. But I think we need to really take a close look at what's happening in different countries. I think in Indonesia, as far as I know, markets still open. The traditional market is still open, but they are practicing all the protocols. And I do know that factories and the extent that you can still produce, you are producing. So I think maybe Indonesia, it'd be interesting to know whether Indonesia is, even though you are doing lockdown and social distancing, that there are still economic activity that's going on. And this is maybe in different countries, there are different levels of economic activity. If you're very constant, like Singapore, because it's only one area, then they have to close down everything. But I think, as Aaditya was mentioning, and then I was also emphasizing, that if with data you can actually be able to plan, where you should be doing containment and locking down, and where you can have limited economic activity, and then once your numbers start coming down, then you also know how to slowly open up. And that's really what I call smart containment policy. And because at the end of the day, protect lives or protect livelihoods. People always say, well, if I can't work and I can't eat, I would rather die of COVID rather than die of hunger. You hear a lot of people use that kind of statement. So I think there's some truth to that statement. So if you are going to exercise a lockdown where people can't have a livelihood, can't eat, then that's why you need the social protection to come in, to make sure that they can, while you are having this lockdown and they can't have livelihood, that they can still live. And this is the smart containment, hopefully emergency short-term period, right? It's not, it doesn't go on, hopefully not. We try to make it as short as possible. And it can only be short if you succeed in the containment and the mitigation. So there's this trade-off between that you have to plan very well. Yeah. The second question was there enough stimulus, right?
Stimulus, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question to answer, because at the moment, I think the government is doing what it can to deliver the cash transfer, and Indonesia should be thankful that they already have these programs that they can scale up, and then the community-based systems can actually work. And I would say that the key role is the role of local government more so than the national government, because to be able to implement a lot of these community-based programs, it really relies on local government. And I'm talking not just about the governor level or the mayor level. I'm talking about even the RT level, right? Yeah. The household level. Because I remember when we were doing our delivery of Raskin, the food subsidized rice program. In the end, it was not delivered based on a household survey of the poorest household. In the end, it was delivered through the community, and the community knows who is the poor people in their community, right? So this is, I think I'm becoming to be a great believer that governments have a role, but communities have an even greater role, because they are right there in the community. So the community can do a lot to do the self-protection and the mitigation, as well as have a system where they can help each other out. And when you're trying to give assistance, they can also be part of your delivery mechanism. And that's why the village program is going to be quite interesting to be able to deploy the program DESA, because that's really at a very community level, right? And they have to have also follow the program of the protocol, and at what if there's somebody from the outside coming in, they have to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. This mudik, when people going back for Lebaran, I don't know what the policy is, but you can imagine, if just like what happened in China with the Chinese New Year, people going home, and that can lead to a big spread. Because just the final thing I would say is that what you don't want is, okay, you have a successful mitigation and containment, then you relax too early. This is the big debate. You relax too early, then you have a second wave, or somehow rather there's another spot, like exactly what happened in Singapore. Then they have a second wave and a third wave, and then your recession will become longer, and your recovery is going to become longer. So that's why it's important. I don't know whether Aaditya want to add anything.
Just to support your points in two ways, Ibu Mari, I think, de facto, it might, you can think of a shutdown or social distancing along a continuum. Sometimes there are countries, like China was able to do, like Philippines or maybe India, where they're very stringent shutdowns. But it is possible, and I know less about this than you, that de facto Indonesia's shutdown may be a little more porous, a little softer. But I think, again, as I said, if you had better information and you were able to test and track, for any desired level of shutdown, you would run a smaller health risk, because you could decide who should go out and work and who is infected, and then you could track them. Or for any desired level of containment, you could achieve better economic outcomes, because again, you could be. So that's why what Ibu Mari said, that the risk, even if you succeed in suppressing, of this disease coming back is great. So how we prepare for that outcome, we can't all become Singapore's or the Republic of Korea, but I do think that, testing is not rocket science. These new PCR assay machines that the Indonesian government has bought, many of them do require complementary skills. But some of them, they're new cartridge-based gene expert machines, which are pretty accurate and not so skill-intensive and reliable. So I think I've become a little bit of a monomaniac when it comes to seeing testing as really the only plan B. On the stimulus, if I can say, I think Indonesia has reacted very strongly. Again, Ibu Satu should speak to this. But, I think the stimulus is as much as 2.5% of GDP. I think the projected deficit is going to be larger, maybe closer to, say, 5% of GDP. But here again, I think it's very important what form the stimulus takes. You will need, and this is the kind of crisis that will overwhelm the capacity of all countries, rich and poor. And therefore, even though I think there will be scope for external support, there is a need also for internal reform. And there, for example, thinking of how expenditures are better allocated. If there are subsidies which are less socially productive, whether they can be phased out and directed towards the kind of support that people and firms need. If more can be done to strengthen tax administration and tax design and reform, these are the kinds of structural reforms which the crisis gives an opportunity for, which are desperately needed now, but can also create the basis for a stronger recovery.
Aaditya, do you want me to come in? Or?
Satu, I would like you to answer all the questions instead of me. But you should
I don't think I can answer all the questions, but no, it's a tricky question, as Ibu Mari said, and it's impossible to say. what is the right level of fiscal stimulus. The government has already extended close to 3 percentage points of GDP worth of economic measures. And is it adequate? As I mentioned earlier, no. I mean, there are still groups of people that remain uncovered. And there is right now also discussion of yet the fourth package of stimulus measures that then might be rolled out. But there is this question also, I think Ibu Mari alluded to that one. How much can government finance? I mean, it is another hard constraint that is coming. And in order to make to make fiscal space for this support, indeed, I mean, this is then an opportunity to also look at that are there some spending categories that should be rechanneled, such as subsidies, now to social protection. And it's an opportunity that you have at the time of the crisis. But these are kind of questions that are very much discussed and thought about right now in Indonesia. So let me stop there.
Okay, probably I would like to introduce Ibu Satu Kakonen to the audience. Ibu Satu Kakonen is the World Bank Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, joining the position in February 2020. Thank you very much, Ibu. So next question is actually regarding the projection of the World Banks, especially in Indonesia. So we have the worst case scenario, minus 3.5. Do you give us a hint? What will it look like if we go into that kind of direction, and what kind of policy that should we do to avoid that?
I'm now no longer able to answer questions on Indonesia, actually.
Okay. Maybe Dr. Matto can weigh in.
But I think in general, that's why it's important to minimize how long you're going to be in the recession, right? And focus on good policies to get you to recovery. And I think that's why it's key to protect the livelihoods and protect the firms. And I think this is where a policy that will, if you have, this is the big issue for all, not just Indonesia, all countries. How do you prevent the worst case scenario of a large contraction? And I think if you have limited resources, budgetary resources, then you have to really make sure that what you're spending it on and what policies you undertake will have the biggest impact for the economic side and social side, and allow you to have a base when the recovery happens to be able to recover. And I think we already talked about the social protection and how to safeguard the middle class, which is a difficult issue. But then how do you, I think the one on firms is a bit more difficult, because you have the formal sector, you have the corporate sector, and if you have limited resources, this is the big question. What type of firms, how do you pick the firms to be supported? And here there's a lot of discussion. Maybe we should prioritize, okay, firms that are delivering essential services, for instance, then they should be given priority. Or firms that are employing a lot of labor, maybe that's another priority. Or tourism, or whatever, And I think to the point that Aaditya was making about being creative and innovative, I think that's also, if you remember the example I gave about my friend who repurposed the production to making masks and protective clothing. I also have other examples where, a tissue company is now also making masks. So how do you repurpose and actually find opportunity is also, and maybe give reward to firms that are able to do that, right? Those are just some ideas. I don't think I want to get into let's put it this way. We know things are going to be bad. I think what we should be focusing on is what are the steps that the government can do, as well as the communities and so on, to make it less worse, because we know it's going to be bad, right? So maybe on those kind of philosophical note, I'll turn it either to Aaditya or Satu if they want to have a go at this question. Anybody want to have a go at this question?
I'll just say a few quick things. I really think that containing the disease is really crucial at home, but I think unfortunately there are also global externalities, because Indonesia is not an island, and therefore also I think one big negative externality for everybody has been the underpreparedness of large countries whose economies matter for global demand, for commodities, for everything. So I think that is one crucial question of whether, of course, Indonesia's own economy, for it to be meaningfully revived, effectively containing the disease, but then making sure that what is a real shock doesn't become a financial shock. It doesn't hurt the balance sheets of banks and firms. This twin balance sheet problem we've seen in everywhere from India to Japan can be debilitating. It can really affect recovery. And the third thing is, of course, that it's really important that Indonesia, as I said, has done many remarkable things. It's lifted more people out of poverty than most other countries in the world, but it hasn't really fully taken advantage. It was one of the countries which was leading manufacturing growth, but it has been largely left out of global value chains. So I think thinking of what are the kind of reforms of trade policy, investment policy that can create the conditions for future growth. Because one of the remarkable pieces of evidence that came from this research by my colleague Bob Rikers and Mary Hallward on Indonesia was that firms which entered during the crisis, it's not just those who survived, but new firms were among the most dynamic firms in the future. So I think creating the conditions for that to happen. But again, these are general points, and I think Ibu Satu will hopefully provide more Indonesia-specific texture.
Thank you, Aaditya. Actually, you mentioned the points that you made are very important. I mean, the projections, our growth projections for Indonesia have been lowered from the 2.1 in the past few weeks, and now indeed, I mean, we are projecting that the economic growth will basically come to a halt in this calendar year. Whether it will become deeply negative, it's not only in the hands of Indonesia, but it also depends on the severity of the global crisis. What is going to be the external demand? What kind of pull factors there are going to be coming from outside Indonesia? So it's going to be partly a result of what's happening inside Indonesia, how long the economy will be in lockdown, and also how severe the crisis is going to be throughout the world. Now, what can Indonesia do in order then to recover fast and accelerate also the opportunities, accelerate the recovery and provide opportunities for businesses? Partly the packages that have now already been introduced, and the fourth package that is focusing then more on the businesses, they're part of the solution. But what is very important at this juncture is basically look at what kind of, because crisis is always an opportunity. Yes, nobody, I mean, crises are bad, but they are also opportunity to try to change the trajectory of the economy. And this is a great opportunity for Indonesia to proceed with the structural reforms that are needed to make the space for the private sector, to ease the operation of the private sector, so that when the acute health crisis is over, the businesses, the investment will come and the businesses will be able to operate and grow. So this is something that we would very much like to see Indonesia to take advantage of in the coming months to promote the economic recovery of Indonesian economy. We hope that we are not going to the minus 3.5 growth scenario, but it's a possibility.
Thank you very much. Okay, probably next question is regarding the international collaboration book. As you mentioned, this is actually the time that we need it the most, but I don't know, what's your read on this?
I think we need to have international collaboration on the health, on the trade side, and on the health side. We also need to think about the collaboration for the production of vaccines and so on. So I think on the health side, obviously, it's about making sure that we are sharing information about the pandemic, and as we close borders because we are doing mitigation, how do we make sure that it's not like preventing the essential goods from being able to move, and that is in particular for medicine, medical supplies, food, and other vital goods. Yeah, and this has been a call by the World Bank. We've been making this call. The G20 has actually come out with statements along those lines. So it's about the export restrictions as well as the import barriers and the actual cross-border movement, the transportation and the logistics that needs to continue to flow to prevent a further damage or further, if you restricted the medical supplies to where it's needed, then the countries that are already having a weak health system are going to suffer even more. I mean, our data actually shows that the poorest countries in Africa are dependent on very concentrated. Their dependence is very concentrated on 3 suppliers in advanced countries. In the moment that the supply is restricted, then they don't get any supplies. It's very extreme. With food, we are really worried about the potential for food insecurity. And one shouldn't be worried about it because this is different from 2008. In 2008, we had the food crisis was actually triggered by countries imposing export restrictions on wheat, on rice, and then there was a huge spike in price. But at that time, there was a shortage of supply because of drought and so on. Today, the food stocks actually are in plenty of supply, but countries, because they're nervous, they want to protect themselves, they start putting in restrictions or building up buffer stock. Yeah, and it's unnecessary to do that, and we need to make sure that the food supply also continues to flow, because then you will have a double crisis if you also had food insecurity on top of that. So there needs to be global cooperation to make sure that that doesn't happen. And the other dimension of global cooperation, so that's a health as well as a food and trade dimension. The other dimension is on the debt relief that we have proposed between the World Bank and IMF, and that is about collaboration to make sure that you try as much as possible to help the poorer countries to have debt suspension and be able to restructure their debt so that they have the fiscal space to be able to respond. And the World Bank and regional development banks, they're coming in with fresh funds to help governments with their budget support to be able to do all those stimulus package and so on. But again, we go back to the previous discussion. We've got to make sure that these funds are going to be used effectively. Yeah, and then you can get into a discussion for protecting livelihoods, stimulus of firms, and so on and so forth. And I think the final one I would share on the global collaboration on the health side is really about production of vaccines, therapeutic medicine, and even the diagnostics. How can we have collaboration there to enable developing countries to get fair and equitable access to these important medicines. There is at the moment a lot of collaboration happening on vaccine production, from the research to the production, and there's a lot of discussion about whoever is going to find the vaccine first should be able to share it with others to be able to produce it at scale, right? And there's a big discussion going on around that. And once you produce it, how can poor countries be able to access it at an affordable price? And then there is a whole discussion about in the trade world, it's called compulsory licensing.
Mhm.
It basically means that you override the 20-year patent, and there are regulations, and the WTO allows for that if it is about producing medicine that is needed for a crisis or a public good, a public crisis. And that's the example is the HIV/AIDS medicine. So these are some of the thinking that's going on, because I think to me the production of the vaccine, I don't know when people say it can be 12 months, it can be 18 months. That is the certainty. This is the certainty point that this is what can stop the pandemic, right? But of course, the therapeutic and the testing is equally important as well. So this needs global collaboration on that front. So there are many other issues on the global collaboration, but that's kind of in brief what I've been going through for the last 6 weeks.
Thank you, Ibu. Dr. Matto, probably you want to add some more information?
I think that was such an excellent response that I have very little. If I can just say one thing, and it's more about my own institution, I think the bank is very rightly focusing a lot on country level work, but I think understanding better how we can contribute to global public goods. And I think health and disease, I think these are issues where we really need to work together, exactly as Ibu Mari described. And I think they're very nice, powerful examples, like, how the nice example Ibu Mari gave of compulsory licensing, which worked in the case of AIDS drugs in certain contexts. Even if it wasn't used, it led to a cheaper, wider availability of AIDS drugs. Similarly, advanced market commitments, which were promises to purchase drugs for which there wasn't thing, made a big difference in the development of the pneumococcal vaccine. There's public-private partnerships led to the development of the meningitis vaccine, which almost completely wiped out meningitis from a lot of African countries. So I think those kinds of initiatives. But just to add two other things, that even apart from fighting disease and keeping trade open, we also will probably need greater macroeconomic policy coordination as we go forward, especially to the recovery phase. And finally, there are interesting, important examples. There was an initiative that the bank and the fund worked with private sector banks called the Vienna Initiative, which was, given the kind of financial crisis we have and the capital flight we are beginning to see, it was also a public-private partnership to ensure that banks did not run away from developing countries. It's another kind of scarcity nationalism. Just as medicines, food, even credit tends to be hoarded, and I think that's where I think Ibu Mari's presence as a champion of openness and public goods is going to strengthen the bank, and hopefully she'll use the bank as a fulcrum to do good for the whole world.
I just wanted to add one more thing I forgot, that
Sure.
besides global, regional cooperation is also equally important. And here is actually where East Asia can play a role in terms of, continuing its openness agenda, even during the COVID crisis. And like what happened during the 2008 food crisis, we also, in the end, disciplined ourselves not to impose restrictions on rice exports, for instance. And just to add to Aditya's point about what the World Bank is doing in the health space, actually we are doing quite a lot, because we learn a lot from what happened during Ebola, for instance. So we do have pandemic monitoring systems in countries, and We're also supporting a lot of the, there's this organization called CEPI, which is the Center for Epidemiology and what's the P? I forgot, institute, but it's the one that's, it's doing the research and development for some of the vaccines, and we are doing support for that. And the final thing I would say is that the One Health system is part of the pack in the first phase of emergency response that the World Bank gave for the health response, and going into the more medium-term response on health. You know, it's about, okay, we need to respond immediately, but we want to do it so that it's also building resilience in the country for future pandemic, to prevent future spread of infectious diseases. And the One Health system is basically about how do you make sure that the mix of humans and animals can be prevented, because that is being identified as the cause of the disease. So it's about not having live animals in the market, or if you have live animals, how do you do it? How do you separate it from human? And we actually went through this during the bird flu. I was Minister of Trade during the bird flu, and we said, you cannot slaughter, you know, how do you keep the birds separate from the market, the people who are in the market? You have to have separate slaughterhouse, etc., etc. So I think this is again homework for developing countries to develop resilience of the One Health system, apart from the primary care and the universal care and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. That is very comprehensive answer. I think this is I think our time is up already. So I'm so sorry if I cannot accommodate all of the questions. I don't know, I think we have more than 40 questions right now. So they're all excited about this this webinar. So yeah, we're sorry, we are sorry that we cannot accommodate all of that. Probably I will ask each of you to have some final words for us probably in Indonesia right now. Maybe give us some optimism, and then to get through in this challenging time. Or probably you want to have a opinion regarding the to the government officials as well, probably. Thank you.
I just have a very simple message. You know, things are bad, but I think we can pull through this. And if we just focus on three things: protect lives, protect livelihoods, and protect the future. And there are different things that we need to do in each of these three buckets. And you have to do it like it's not separate buckets; they're linked. If you do well in the first bucket, you're going to help in the second and the third bucket, and so on. So I think you have to think in those terms. And somebody said, this is like running a marathon. It's not a sprint; it's a marathon. You have to think about it in that way.
Thank you,
Aditya.
Yeah.
Any last
Dr. Matto?
closing remarks?
I think, I think those are really the central messages. And I'll say something which is not so much last remarks, is to say that, what I presented today, I tend to present with too much conviction. The truth is that we don't know a lot about what we need to know. And I think here, we've learned so much from East Asian resilience, East Asian enterprise, and East Asian innovations. I think this is again an opportunity for us to have meaningful dialogue, understanding, analysis together. And I hope very much that we can continue to collaborate with institutes like yours. It was a fantastic opportunity to come back virtually. But I think if we can have many such conversations,
Sure.
and also conversations where I don't hold forth, but I have an opportunity to listen to all of you, and so we can benefit from what you are learning, and at the same time have bigger regional, global conversations. I think that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me, and
Thank you
thanks to
very
Ibu Mari for including me, even though this was really her show. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I think it was a very timely and also fruitful discussion that we had today. Thanks to our two distinguished speakers, Professor Mari Pangestu and Dr. Aaditya Matto, for their time and sharing. Lastly, I would like also to thank all the CSIS team and also all of you that participate in this webinar. Please stay healthy, and I hope to see you all in the next CSIS webinar. Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.